All right, we want to begin today by talking about the union of church and state and subsequent reactions. It's been a while since we looked at Constantine, and at that time we looked upon Constantine favorably because he brought about the end of persecution. And as I often say, if I lived in those days, I would have voted Constantine Man of the Year because he would have brought an end to persecution in the church. He would have ended the threat that I or my family or my friends or my pastor might be imprisoned, or our church destroyed, or our scriptures confiscated, or even that we might even be tortured or executed for our faith in Christ. And so we rejoice at the end of persecution. But for the church, it came with a price, with a hidden price that probably was not even noticed at first, but brought about one of the most significant changes in the history of the church. Christianizing the empire, there are some questions about Constantine. You remember the story about his conversion experience, that it was accompanied by a vision and or a dream. We have two different stories. If we conflate the two stories together, he was on the eve of a major battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, when his enemy Maxentius left the protection and confines of the city of Rome and approached Constantine and his army. The battle was going to take place at the Milvian Bridge, and Constantine saw in the sky the Chi Rho, and this symbol of the Chi and the Rho juxtaposed, the Chi Rho being the first two letters of Christos. And along with this sign came the words, "By this sign you will conquer." Then that night he had a dream in which the voice of God told him that if he would put this sign on his soldiers' shields, that he would win the battle the next day. Well, certainly all that came to place. And not only did he defeat Maxentius, but Maxentius fell into the Milvian River and drowned. So Constantine won the battle and ultimately became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. And then he began a policy of favoring Christianity. But the question is, did he actually convert to Christianity himself? Was Constantine a Christian? There are a number of reasons why his conversion comes into question. One is that he continued to be involved with paganism. He continued to consider himself the Pontifex Maximus, the leader of the pagan religion. He continued to participate in pagan rituals. His coins included symbols of the unconquered sun, Invictus Sol. We know that his father had worshipped Invictus Sol, and because of that, Constantine and his family were accustomed to worshiping a single god. But of course, the Invictus Sol was a pagan god and not Jesus. So Constantine continued to mint his coins with this symbol. Why did he delay baptism until his death? This is a good question. He wasn't baptized until he was on his deathbed. Why might Constantine legitimately have delayed his baptism even if he were a Christian? Can anyone think of an answer to his delay of baptism?
Forgiveness for
Yes, Ryan. There's the question about forgiveness for post-baptismal sins. And who would be most concerned about post-baptismal sins such as murder? An emperor or anyone in state government would be concerned about the issues of war and capital punishment. And so we find that in many cases, those who were known Christians in the government would delay their baptism. And so the fact that he delayed his baptism is not necessarily an indication of his failure to convert. Now, why would he favor Christianity politically? Okay, some ask if he would simply use Christianity as the cement of the empire. Anybody have any discussion about this aspect of his favoritism toward Christianity? Does anyone have any idea how many members, how many of the Roman Empire were Christian at this time? About 5 to 10%. So it was far from a majority of the population of the empire. However, can you talk about the geographic distribution of Christian churches? It was extensive. Almost every major city in the Roman Empire circling the Mediterranean Sea had the presence of a church or a significant number of house churches. Okay? So he could see that Christianity was widespread. However, I would still say that it takes a kind of political foresight to use Christianity as a force, a unifying force. All right, David, and then Toby.
Even then, it doesn't make sense for him to take Christianity out of all these other pagan religions, considering that this is most of them before. I mean, so it's not like he's gaining that much political ground among the people. Like, hey, let me get this religion that's obscure, 5 to 10% of the population, and they're all going to be mostly poor.
Right.
They're not going to be able to help me politically in any way.
Right. Okay. Well, let's. I think that is a good point, because our impression of the majority of Christians is that they were poor, lower class. However, we should not overlook the fact that there indeed were some high class, even nobility, who were included among the Christians. In the late first century, when Domitian was conducting his persecution, there actually were some members of his own household that were favorable to Christianity. The empress in around 215 called Origen to Rome to speak to her. So it is not that there were no members of nobility, but I would say yes, that the majority of Christians were lower social class, and perhaps not many, but some of the nobles would have considered themselves Christians. Toby, did you have a comment?
I just think it's neat. I never looked at Constantine or even thought about him like this in his relation to Christianity. But I think it just is simple politics. Even going back to the Roman Empire, be it Christianity or be it any faith or religion, I think you can look not just in Rome or the U.S. or whatever region. I think political leaders have been using faith and religion as a form of cement or a solidifier of their cause for centuries, and I'm going to stop and not say anymore. But okay. I think it's still done.
We're still facing the union of church and state today, even in the United States, which professes a separation of church and state. Okay. However, let me hasten to say that in the United States, even though we see a kind of a symbiotic influence between church and state, still we're separated in ways that history never knew before the American Constitution. Okay, but conversely, I would say that civilization has almost always experienced a union of religion and state, and the state has always depended on some kind of religion to bring unification to its citizens. Yes, Ronald?
Maybe an alternative explanation. Maybe this is actually evidence that he was a Christian, that his association with the Christians would lead him to attempt to Christianize the empire. And I'm reminded Paul's admonition to young believers to not make them pastors. It's either Paul or Hebrews that kind of gives that warning. And I'm wondering, okay, he's a political leader who's a new Christian, and maybe we're looking at an example there of somebody doing what they're not supposed to do. I don't know if that's the answer, just musing out loud.
Okay. Well, very good. This is an interesting point. I believe it is Paul speaking to Timothy, warning him not to lay hands suddenly on someone. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't want me just to grab Richard by the neck and throttle him. No, he's saying that you should not lay hands on new believers to elevate them to church positions. And do we do that in our society with some new believers that happen to be celebrities? Do we put them up on the pedestal, and then do we find what a terrible mistake that is when they do something that is not Christ-like? And yet, what do we expect? Okay, so I think what Ronald is saying is a good warning about putting new Christians into places of influence, and even more so in authority. And here we have Constantine, who is a relatively new believer, if that, and he has been catapulted into the ultimate authority. Okay, but back to the idea of the union of religion and state. The Roman Empire, throughout its history, had united the worship of the Roman gods, headed by the Roman emperor, for centuries. That had been its practice. That was much of the motivation behind the persecution of Christians, in that the Christians violated this union of the Roman Empire with its gods. And so now that Constantine wanted to reject or put aside the Roman gods, instead of establishing religious freedom, instead he placed Christianity into that spot of union with the state, with the expectation that Christianity would be this unifying force for his new empire. Well, fortunately for us, it is not up to our judgment whether or not Constantine was a true Christian. But what we can judge is that his adherence to this new faith brought about a major change in the church, as well as in the empire, as he encouraged the transformation of the empire from a pagan state church to a Christian state church. I think we can say that Constantine was a political genius. From his comparatively meager understanding of Christianity and his brief contact with it, he concluded two things. One, Christianity would become the dominant religious system of the world. And two, the dying Roman Empire could be saved, or at least prolonged, by a union with this dynamic religion. Constantine wanted Christianity to become the cement of the empire. He wanted religion to act as a unifying factor in the political system. The idea was not altogether new, for religion had always been a part of the Roman system of government. Constantine's innovation was in exchanging a state-projected syncretism that invited all who would to join for a widespread and powerful movement that was exclusive in its view of God and its requirements for admission. Okay, so let's see how this affects the church. All right, it was a gradual process. Constantine appointed Christians to offices. He took on some as personal advisors. He ordered the destruction of pagan temples, and then he removed the pagan idols from temples and displayed them publicly as works of art. All right, what's going to happen when you take a statue of Apollo out of the temple and you put it in the city square? Is Apollo being worshipped now? No, he's just simply a statue, a work of art. And so he was really denigrating the gods by taking them out of the temples. Now remember that Constantine's conversion came at the end of this great persecution. And what had Diocletian and Galerian done with the churches during that time? He destroyed them, or he confiscated the property. And so Constantine donated property and money for churches. He provided funds and protection to bishops traveling to councils, as we're about to see. He gave his sons a Christian education. All right, he exempted the clergy from military and from taxation. He abolished pagan customs, and by 325 he was exhorting subjects to embrace Christianity. One of his biggest changes and boldest moves was to move his capital from Rome all the way to the east to what was called Byzantium, to a new city he named after himself, Constantinople. Today we know it as Istanbul. Okay, but his movement of his capital to Constantinople undercut the power of senators, because in Rome the senators still clung to their old pagan Roman gods. But when he moved his capital to Constantinople, then he pretty much undercut their power. So even though they were typically pagans and typically hostile to Christianity, they did not have as much control over him or the government when he moved. Now, he considered himself Pontifex Maximus and Bishop of Bishops. You may have heard the term pontiff before, referring to the Pope. Pontifex, Latin for bridge. So the Pope considers himself the bridge to God. Constantine considered himself the great bridge to God, and he considered himself to be above all the bishops of the church. But he also considered himself the pagan high priest. So he's keeping his feet in both worlds. The result of this union of church and state was what I call the Constantinian symbiosis. Symbiosis means life that is dependent on each other. So church and state became dependent on each other under Constantine. Also, as it's pointed out in Justo Gonzalez, this led to an official theology. And so there's a new understanding of culture under Constantine. For one thing, Christianity now is the crowning touch of the Greco-Roman tradition. All that has gone on in the last several centuries in Greece and in Rome has led up to Christianity. Church and state mutually supportive, religious unity necessary for political unity. Now, dissent from Christianity is considered political treason, and imperial force was used against dissenters. So that now the official church connected to the emperor can call upon the resources of the state to force conformity and to suppress dissent. Now, if there had been dissent in the church before, how did they handle that dissent? They gathered together in synods, didn't they? They met together as bishops to discuss Gnosticism, Montanism, Marcion, and they would use their influence to persuade, but they had no political power to suppress. But now they do. Now, whoever has the ear of the emperor can enforce conformity to their version of Christianity. And we're going to see how this works well and poorly. Now, there were some positive results. Persecution of Christians stopped. There was more open forum for the gospel. Now people could preach openly and evangelize openly. More people were reached. They influenced legislation. The conditions of women and slaves improved, and moral standards were raised. So we have many positive results from Christianizing the empire. We have enough positive results to fill up one slide. But we're going to see that there are 4 slides that list the negative results. We have a wholesale entrance of pagans into the church because all of a sudden the church is the in place to be. And as they come in, they're going to bring in their own ideas and their own practices. They need discipleship, but not all of them are going to get the discipleship that they need. Pagan holidays. Easter and Christmas especially are going to be problematic. We'll talk about them later, so let me just pass over them quickly here. But yes, we're going to bring in pagan holidays. Yes, Cody?
Back on the positives,
Yeah.
how were the moral standards raised, like with so many pagans coming into the faith? Like, I would have thought the opposite would have happened, but how is it that moral standards are raised for that? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Yes. Well, because now at least Christianity is having an official impact on legislation and social expectations. Okay, so we're eventually going to see, very soon after this, we're going to see the end of gladiator games, for example. And so, is that all right? All right. Yeah, even though the gladiator games are kind of cool, they're also kind of bloody. Okay, and so they were brought to an end. The plays that were put on were less bawdy. So public morality was improved. Okay, all right. But at the same time, pagans coming into the church are going to minimize the spirituality of the churches. Okay? Okay, Christian exaltation of martyrs is going to combine with the pagan worship of Roman household gods to develop the cult of the saints. Okay, so we're going to have pagans coming into the church, and they're accustomed to worshiping those who have died before them. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, okay, you remember that the hero of the story had his household gods with him. They were gods of his ancestors, and that was it's an important part of his religious cult and his worship. Okay, so Christians would remember that idea from their old life, and they would put Christian martyrs into that kind of role. And so they began to expect martyrs to pray for them. And eventually they're going to have the expectation that martyrs died with more merit than they needed to get into heaven, and so that merit could be passed on to them. They would go to the places where the martyrs died, and they would worship there, thinking that they could be closer to God by worshiping where the martyrs died or where they were buried. Okay, so we're seeing this exaltation of martyrs. It's kind of a development of kind of a Christian superstition. Is anybody writing on that topic? Okay, Richard is. Okay, good. So there's enough of a development of superstition among these Christian churches because of the cult of the saints, relics that martyrs left behind, pilgrimages to their place of death or their place of burial. So we're going to see a kind of a rise of superstition there. The prosperity of the church was seen as divine favor. And so as Constantine blessed the church and provided it with the material resources, that was seen as divine favor. Christianity became secularized. The empire was divided into regions that became religious dioceses. We're going to talk over and over about the Diocese of Alexandria, the Diocese of Antioch, and so on and so forth. Well, these all coincided with political divisions. We see this in Louisiana because instead of counties, we have parishes. Okay, so that's kind of a picture of what was going on here on a much larger scale. And so the geographic divisions led to an intermixture of the world and the church. It was as if you live in the region of Alexandria, you're going to be considered a member of the Alexandrian church or the Antiochene church. And we have a development of ecclesiastical hierarchy for the purpose of administration and uniformity, which is a reflection of the hierarchy in the state. There were 4 archbishoprics, that is the highest bishops, the highest dioceses. Initially were Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Later, Jerusalem is going to fall out and Constantinople is going to take its place. We'll talk more about that later. There were changes in worship. Christian worship had been simple as Christians gathered in houses, but now they began to gather in ornate church buildings, many of them funded by Constantine. Now, there were church buildings built in the late 200s, during the period of time between the persecution of Decius and Valerian that ended around 260. In the next 40 years, there was peace for the Christians, and so it was during this time that they began to build a number of churches, but those were the churches that were destroyed during the Great Persecution. And so big churches began to be built, and an elaborate liturgy or the service of worship was developed. Worship was influenced by imperial protocol. Incense is now being burned in the churches as to show worship of God, because incense had been burned in the palaces. Genuflection, you know that the Catholics, when they enter the church as a sign of honor to God, they genuflect. Well, this was the kind of gestures that would be made before the emperor, and so the honor paid to the emperor began to be paid to God. And officiating ministers had worn everyday clothes, but now they wore luxurious garments that set them apart. And so we see at this time a development of this clerical aristocracy, this idea that the clergy are the super Christians, and lay people are not involved in worship or in service. Do we still have this problem in churches today? Okay, we still have this problem today, in that people in churches think, oh, witnessing, serving, working, that's the job of the paid clergy. It's not my job. Well, this kind of began here in the Constantinian symbiosis of the church and state. Choirs were added for pomp during this time. And so we see big changes in worship. This is one of the biggest changes that we find in worship is that we've gone from simplicity to elaborate formal liturgy. All right, theologically, what happened? If you are satisfied with the kingdom of God on earth, what's that going to do to your eschatological expectations? You're going to forget that Jesus is coming, because as far as you're concerned, the kingdom is here. And so the expectations diminished, and comfort set in with Christianity. And then Christianity became the persecuting power. Christians who had been persecuted now had the power to assert themselves and to persecute others. Wars of the empire became holy wars, and the emperor expected the church to side with him against the enemies. Church leaders looked for the state to support them in their ecclesiastical judgments against dissenters. Emperors convened councils. We're going to see throughout our study of the councils that every one of them was convened by an emperor concerned about theological divisiveness in his empire. And the emperors are going to influence the proceedings. And so Christians began to persecute pagans, Jews, and even other Christians who disagreed with them. Okay. And we see this throughout history, that those who have been persecuted, when they gain the power, they become the persecutors. One example that comes quickly to mind is the Puritans in England were suppressed by the Anglican Church. During the interregnum, they managed to get a charter that allowed them to establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony in America, and it gave them freedom from the Anglican Church to establish a colony that supported the Congregationalist Church. So they had freedom. They had freedom from the Church of England, but it was freedom for themselves only. And when we have the Baptists developing and the Quakers developing, the Congregationalists suppressed them. So the persecuted become the persecutors. And it happens over and over and over again in church history. Okay. So, we have now the church in the empire is settled, is comfortable, it's free of persecution. Do you think everybody is happy? No. I mean, Christians are never always happy, right? Okay. Before we move on, let me just ask, are any more questions about this union of church and state in Rome, or any other comparisons you see with the situation in 325 and later or today? All right, well, let's talk about the reactions. One reaction we want to talk about is the monastic reaction. The persecutions of early centuries strengthened the church. After Constantine made Christianity the religion of the empire, the church became secure, but it became comfortable and weak. People were joining the church because of privilege and position without learning the meaning of Christian living. And the rich and powerful began to dominate the church. Okay? So whereas at one time the church was characterized by the poor and the socially downcast, now the church was characterized by the rich and the powerful. But what if you were a Christian who wanted to demonstrate your devotion to Christ. In centuries past, you could hope and pray for persecution and martyrdom that would prove that you were a Christian athlete. But now, persecution has ended, so how is it that you can prove your devotion to Christ? Jesus taught the way to salvation was a narrow path, but now society was intent on making it a wide avenue with much affluence. How do you witness to the crucified Lord who had nowhere to lay his head, while many leaders of the church now live in costly homes? Well, many opted to flee society, leave possessions behind, dominate the body and its passions, and embrace the monastic life. So we see the rise of monasticism during this time as an opportunity to prove, to demonstrate, to develop one's devotion to Christ. Okay, biblical reasons for withdrawing from society and fleeing from marriage. Well, there's no marriage in heaven, according to what Jesus told the Sadducees. Paul had said unmarried people had greater freedom to serve God, and there were expectations of an immediate parousia. If Jesus is coming back, why bother with marriage? Okay, there were other influences, and I think that not every influence on the monastic movement was biblical or spiritual. We've talked before about dualism, this Greek philosophy that matter is evil and only the spirit is good. Often for Christians, this was turned into the idea that sex is the ultimate material act, and therefore it is evil. The reproductive act is evil. The Stoics suppressed every passion, and the Gnostics. The Gnostics were known for their asceticism, that they would deny the body because the body is meaningless in eternity. So we have some outside influences on monasticism. Well, let's look at one of the earliest examples of monasticism. This is Anthony, sometimes referred to as Saint Anthony or Anthony of Egypt. Anthony lived 251 to 356. So how many years did he live? 105. Is that not amazing? I'm going to say right now that generally speaking, the kind of severe asceticism that is experienced by monastics is not healthy. That many of those who experienced monasticism had serious health problems later in life. John Chrysostom is one of them. Martin Luther is another. Dominic de Guzman. Many times we read about internal ailments caused by too much asceticism, but Anthony is certainly the exception to the rule. Anthony was the son of wealthy parents. They died when he was a young man, so at age 20 he inherited their wealth. But his life changed even more dramatically when he heard a sermon on Mark 10:21. And here's the scripture: "Go and sell all you possess and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." He was so moved by this scripture that he literally acted upon it. He did sell all that he owned, gave it away. Now he had a sister that he needed to care for, and so he took part of his funds and set her up in a convent, which means that already there was a movement among women to separate themselves from society. All right, so Anthony was not the first to live a monastic life, but he was among the first and one of the best known. So he set up his sister, and then he went out into the wilderness to live. His discipline was constant prayer, memorization of Scripture. He had few possessions, worked with his hands, severe fasts, and he deprived himself of sleep. Okay? Some of you may want to deprive yourself of sleep this afternoon. All right, Anthony then went to live among the tombs. So he went out in the cemetery to live, thinking that would be isolated. But people heard about him, and they wanted to get his wisdom, so they followed him to the tombs to ask questions. And so then he said, well, I'm going to barricade myself in this fort. And so he moved into a fort, and the only way he got food was he had allies that would throw food over the wall. But he literally did not see another person for 20 years. Now, so you would think that if he went out to live in isolation from other human beings, that he would be free from all temptations and all distractions and all evil, right? Wrong. Because you know what? He was still there, okay? In all of his human frailty. And it said that he struggled with all kinds of demons. This illustration kind of pictures the artist's impression of how he struggled with demonic forces of lust and pride were coming at him. And so he struggled but disciplined himself against them. And finally, he emerged 20 years later, and he was a hero to other Christians. All right, he inspired the monastic movement in the East. Where we are about to be introduced to Athanasius. Athanasius was a key figure at this time. In fact, was Bishop of Alexandria, and he wrote a biography called The Life of Anthony. And the biography that he wrote made monasticism very popular in the East and made Anthony a hero. All right, let's talk about terms. Monk means solitary. It comes from the word monachos. You can hear the word mono in there, or single. Monachos, monk, is a solitary hermit, also known as an anchorite, withdrawn or fugitive. But then there's cenobitic monasticism, which is communal monasticism. So, Anthony was a solitary monk. He lived in anchorite monasticism, but Pachomius was the founder of communal monasticism. Pachomius had been a soldier who became a Christian during his service, and he had a group of followers that followed him out into the desert, and he established a commune where they would live together. His sister formed a commune for women. And Pachomius' rules were that all members must give up their worldly goods, they must owe absolute obedience to their superiors, they must work with their hands, none must consider any task unworthy, and the basic rule was mutual service, so that even those in authority had to serve those under them. Reminds me of servant leadership, one of our core values, okay, that we just mentioned a while ago. All right? Servant leadership. So that's Pachomius' rules. All right, any questions about monasticism? One thing I want to emphasize is that monasticism actually began before Constantine's conversion and before the union of church and state. Anthony and Pachomius both began their monastic movements before Constantine. However, after Constantine, monasticism became more prevalent and more attractive because the union of church and state made society less attractive. Well, monasticism did not sit well with the bishops, because when monks would come, like when Anthony left his fort and returned to civilization, of course he was befriended by Athanasius of Alexandria, and at that time we have an Arian bishop in the great cities, and Anthony and his followers felt like true leadership belonged to the monks, who had demonstrated through their austere lives their true spirituality. And the bishops lived in great cities and enjoyed power and prestige, and so there was a conflict between monasticism and episcopal power. Many monks, believing that their lives were holier, felt that they should make decisions about church doctrine and practice, and so conflict developed. All right, moving beyond the monastic reaction to the imperial church, we have another reaction from Julian the apostate. Julian was a descendant of Constantine, and he became the emperor in 361. Now, he was a cousin to Constantine's sons. He was educated as a Christian. He was exposed to philosophy, and he abandoned Christianity, especially when the emperor at the time, who was supposedly a Christian emperor, had murdered his father. Okay, and so after the death of this emperor, then when Julian became an emperor, he sought to end Christianity in the empire. And so he decided to restore pagan glory of the Roman Empire and to impede Christianity. So now he's reorganizing the pagan priesthood. He restored the temples. He reinstituted pagan sacrifices. Now there was no overt persecution of Christians, that is to say, no imprisonment, torture, martyrdoms, but he would forbid that Christians teach, and he publicly ridiculed them. But 2 years later, Julian died. His last words, "Galilean, thou hast conquered." Okay. So the pagan reaction did not last long, only 2 years, and Julian died, and otherwise we have nothing but emperors who profess to be Christian. Theodosius is key. He ruled from 378 to 395. He was the first baptized Christian to become an emperor. Okay, in other words, others became emperor, were baptized later at their deaths, but this one was baptized and then became emperor. And in 380, Christianity became the officially established religion of the empire. Okay, so it's not 325. It's not that Constantine made Christianity the official religion. He made it the favored religion, but it is Theodosius in 380 that made Christianity the official state religion. 381, he prohibits heretics and schismatics to meet, and enforces the decision of the councils, bars pagan worship, closes pagan temples. Okay, so 380 we see this definite official, legal, imperial shift from, or at least toward, Christianity. All right, so the union of church and state. What are your reactions? Wouldn't it be great if the church were in charge of the United States of America? We could make homosexual marriage illegal. We could bring about an end to abortion. We could enforce church attendance on Sundays. Wouldn't that be great?
No.
No, Ronald doesn't like that idea. Man, First Baptist Kenner would be overflowing with people if we had a union of church and state in America. What's wrong with that idea? Don't you want First Baptist Kenner to be overflowing with people?
You had a slide earlier on that contrasted the church persecuted and the church free, and there was a descriptor on the church free that said it weakened the church, and it really struck me as true. There's a sense of diluting of the faith when something like this happens, and you can kind of see it in reverse to what's happening now, where cultural Christianity is going away. This is not the 1960s, 1950s, 1940s. Cultural Christianity is no more. Yet those who are true Christians, in a sense, there's a resurgence of certain conservative Christian, I'm speaking in the church, not in culture, but there's a resurgence of conservative Christian doctrine, maybe. And I'm wondering if those two things are related. The death of cultural Christianity will make the true Christian church evident.
Okay. All right. The death of cultural Christianity will make true Christianity evident. Does everybody agree with that? That certainly is my hope and my expectation, because we've seen the reverse of it. So, in other words, to continue with my hypothetical question, what would church be like at First Baptist Kenner if church attendance were required and the place was full? What would Christianity be like in those circumstances? Anybody can answer that, not just Ronnie.
You know, I've seen it with the next generation of teenagers coming in around the church. At Gentilly, we've had a lot of parents who will send kids to church, but they won't come themselves. And so the kids come in because they have to be there. They just basically do whatever they want while the church is trying to operate its business. But the parents won't be there to be able to, like, discipline their children. And so we're having to kind of babysit in addition to trying to worship God, and it's heavily distracting and to the point of being rude to people that are there to see God and having to deal with people cutting up and laughing on the back row, watching YouTube videos.
Okay. All right. So we have an undisciplined group of people if they're in church because they are coerced to be. We're going to find this, by the way, in John Chrysostom's church. So remind me when we get to John Chrysostom, if we ever do. Toby?
I guess, I don't know, I mean, I guess I wish there were a way for there to be Christian values, Christian morality, to be the law of the land without, I would never want to see a time when you were forced to attend a Christian church by the government, but at the same time, I would appreciate a government that was a little bit more in line with morality and ethics of what we hold to as Christians, and you named a few examples. That's just my opinion.
All right. Let me ask this. Has there been a time, of course a lot of y'all are too young, but in the last 30, 40 years, has there been an expectation that moral change was possible from the top down? That is, if we elected certain men as president, that they could impact the morality of the nation? The answer is yes.
Yes.
Yes. All right. I can remember when Ronald Reagan was elected president, I thought that America was going to become Christian again. Okay? And then, of course, we had George Bush the first, then we had Clinton, and then we had George W. Bush, who seemed to me to be among the most evangelical of the presidents in recent memory. And yet, did he even attempt to have an impact on defense of marriage? The answer is no. All right? And certainly we've had no minimizing of abortion. In fact, quite the opposite in terms of what is acceptable. All right? So in other words, we have abortion available at any trimester, including partial birth abortion, and now it is tax supported. Okay, so abortion is even more available now than ever before. Interestingly, and I have to mention this, the abortion rate seems to have declined somewhat, which is astonishing, but nonetheless, that's a fact we need to be aware of. But we cannot expect our elected officials to impact morality in our nation. So how is it that we impact morality in our nation?
From the ground up.
That's right. It's not top down, it's from the ground up. That means it's hard. That means we have to deal with this at our level, at the ground roots. Because union of church and state is not the answer to public morality. Okay? Quite the opposite. Okay? Because you cannot coerce faith. Faith that is forced is not true faith. So if church attendance was enforced by the state, and First Baptist Kenner was full of people, then what would be the true Christian makeup of that church? It'd be a pretty low percentage. What happens when the church meets persecution? It shrinks. But what about the percentage of purity? What about the percentage of true Christians? Okay, it rises. This is what we've seen in the early church. We've seen that in the early church, when it's persecuted, that the church may be small, but it is pure, and it is effective. It not only survives, but it thrives. What have we seen in America with religious freedom? We've seen the churches swell, but many of those are cultural Christians, and so our churches are less pure and less effective. Okay. Does that mean that, let me ask you this way. What influence should our Christian faith have on our voting in November?
I read an article that he referenced the death of cultural Christianity, and I know a lot of people are scratching their heads and wondering how it appears a great majority of evangelicals, Christians, are supporting one political candidate with nice hair. And this article that I read noted that evangelicals and Christianity, it's almost as if they're waving the white flag. We lost the culture war. We're not going to see the Christianization of culture. And it's almost now as if we want someone to represent us who does not care to lift the middle finger in the face of anybody. And I don't know, as a 34-year-old that was alive when Ronald Reagan was president, I just really don't know what to think right now of the election in November.
Okay. Yeah. This is the most puzzling election I've ever approached ever in my life, and I have no way of actually evaluating it, other than to say that that we as Christians need to prayerfully be involved in the political process, but at the same time recognize that that God is in control, no
Amen.
matter who is
Thank
in the
God.
White House. Okay, which does not mean that we give up, but it just means that we use the system as effectively as we can, but realize that the salvation of our nation is not dependent upon our president.
Amen.
It's dependent on us. Okay? So, we need to appreciate the separation of church and state that we enjoy in our nation, and function accordingly. Yes, Cody.
Just being on the subject,
Uh-huh.
I have a question, I guess, just to kind of get your opinion on. I've talked with a lot of people, college students in particular, who, when it comes to elections, they see two different areas of how to vote. You have I can look at America and like the world and say, should I force my opinion on them? And you have like the Christian view of like, what is right, what does God say is right, kind of thing. And a big struggle that I'm seeing is that a lot of people are saying, well, like homosexuality. I know gay marriage is wrong, but is it wrong of me to tell someone that they can't do it because they're not Christians? And so how do you look at that?
Yeah. Well, I go next door and talk to Dr. Riley, who teaches ethics. Okay. I understand what this person is saying, that you cannot legislate morality. I've been hearing this for a long time. And yet, you should not be able to legislate immorality either. Okay, and I think that's where we find ourselves. And it's one thing to allow consenting adults to sin in their own home, but it's another thing to legislate acceptance of sin in an open public situation that is sanctioned by the state, because at that point then those who are opposed for moral religious reasons, then they become the ones who are then subject to persecution. That is, if you oppose homosexual marriage, all of a sudden you can be persecuted by losing your livelihood. And beyond the issue of homosexual marriage, we find that the homosexual agenda goes much further than homosexual marriage, as many of us knew before it was legalized, that the goal of the LGBTQ community, that their goal was to turn society upside down, so that gender bending now is their goal. And we're seeing, of course, we saw in Houston how the lesbian mayor wanted to force all public bathrooms to be open to both genders, and then she actually threatened legal action against pastors who spoke against it. Okay, now that action actually was suppressed in Houston, but now we're seeing it pop up all over the nation. Okay, so I think that those who support the homosexual gender bending agenda, they've tipped their hands to us, and they've revealed to us their full intention, and it's more than just the legitimizing of homosexual relations. Now it is seeking to totally undo civilized understanding of gender. So, what do we do about it? Well, I'm not sure what we can do other than, use the election process as best we can, and then protest and communicate with those in authority. But then it comes back to communicating on a grassroots level, and we've got to be talking to our young people. Those are even, younger than this generation. But we're going to find that this next generation is going to be raised in a society that is totally different than the society in which even you were raised, much less me. So we're going to have to be careful. We're entering in a very strange society. But again, we still operate under a separation of church and state, so that we are functioning on the outside. And it can be that the more we become distinct from society, the more of an impact we can have on society as outsiders. We're going to find ourselves in the same position that Christians found themselves in the first 300 years of the church. Okay? And this is going to be painful for us, but we need to learn the principles of those early Christians as they not only survived but thrived in a pluralistic and hostile society. If we can learn those principles and apply them to our society, perhaps we can have more of an impact than we had in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when cultural Christianity was weak and too much a part of culture, and stood by while other forces took over our country. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes, David?
People like to highlight the 50s and 60s and 70s as this great church growth movement, but yet we also turn a blind eye that Jim Crow was how we had all the segregation, we had people being lynched outside their church buildings and outside their homes and having crosses burned on their yards. Like, we bemoan, like, oh, our country has shifted so far away from Christian principles, but we're founded by people who thought slavery was a good idea, who thought manifest destiny was a good idea, who thought we should send Indians or Native Americans out of their homelands, and thought that was a great idea, thought internment was a great idea. And we bemoan, oh, we've lost all these Christian principles. And I'm like, did we really have true Christian principles when we started?
Okay. Well, very good. These are also challenges to consider as we look back through rosy-colored glasses at the 50s and 60s. All right. I will say, let me talk in a couple of different directions. That during the 50s we had what historians consider to be one of the great awakenings of the 20th century. As Billy Graham had his crusades, millions attended, and hundreds of thousands made professions of faith that were lasting and effective. And Billy Graham was one who worked very hard to integrate his crusades. So there were we can't miss those evangelical Christians who did work against segregation. At the same time, yes, that is a blot on the memory of America in the 50s and the 60s, when the civil rights movement actually began. Later in the 60s, we have the Jesus movement, which was another great awakening among young people anyway, movement toward Christianity. So, to answer your question, there is no perfect time in our history. Every period of time is mixed. And so, I think what I'd like to point out is that yes, we had a period of time where civil rights were suppressed, and we look at that period of time and realize what a fallen nation we were. Okay, let's flip it and say, well, here we are in 2016, and we see the homosexual agenda has flipped upside down our morality, and yet, can we have a spiritual awakening that will bring about true change in our nation today? The answer is yes. Okay, we can look at other periods of time in history. In the 1700s, before the American Revolution, after the Massachusetts Bay Colony had its experiment with the city on a hill that failed, and there was immorality and a large unchurched population. We had the First Great Awakening. After the American Revolution, when everything was disrupted, and again we have deism coming in with its atheism and its skepticism. We have immorality that's rampant, and then all of a sudden we have, and we also have a large unchurched population. All of a sudden, God brings the Second Great Awakening. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm speaking on the fly, is that every period of time has its evil and its good. And every period of time has the potential for God to intervene. But how is God going to intervene?
Church.
Through His people. Through His Holy Spirit working through His people in His churches. Okay. And we will not be able to use the state as our ally. For that we can be grateful. But at the same time, we need to be sure that we are the church, and we're allying ourselves with the Holy Spirit. Okay? All right. Union of church and state. That's all we have time for that subject. So let's end that and move on.